Hey, welcome back to the Church Resource with Dr. Chris Respass.
What's up, my man?
And me, Lucas Pinckard. What's going on, dude?
I'm good, bro. How are you?
I'm fantastic.
You look fantastic.
Well, thank you. On the Church Resource, we talk about the best resources for church leaders and lay people. That's our little tagline.
All right.
How's
I like
that sound?
that.
Yeah?
I like it.
Thanks, AI.
Come on.
Not really. So somebody,
Keep chatting.
Yeah, somebody told me yesterday, as a matter of fact, that they think Christians shouldn't use AI. Man. I don't want to get into that whole conversation, but here's...
Wait, go ahead. Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Here's my thought on it. Okay. Did you know that the Terminator and the Matrix were both written by the same lady?
I did not.
Yep. So it's this sweet little African-American church lady wrote both of these.
What?
Check this out. That Neo and John Connor, same dude.
No.
Yeah. That's the thread that you pull between the Terminator and the Matrix. The Terminator is one of the machines on the full takeover that is going back to try to do that, and that John Connor comes in and does that's the thread between the two. And it's supposed to tell the messianic story of how the enemy is trying all throughout time to prevent the Messiah from coming because he knows the end of the story.
Right.
And the Messiah gets there and then is able to do it. And so the Matrix 2 and 3 were stuff that the guys who were the original directors that they wrote, they decided to make it a trilogy.
Gotcha.
The same thing with Terminator 2. She wasn't a part of that. But Terminator 1 and the Matrix, part of the same storyline.
Wow.
Yeah, and it all is supposed to tie back into the messianic story. Pretty cool.
That is cool.
Yeah, I was like, hey, that's also, especially coming off these episodes where we're talking about digital ministry. There you go.
Indeed.
I don't think showing Terminator or the Matrix in service is probably going to be your best bet. Right? I don't know that the rating system on those is exactly
we have to definitely
church
use some
appropriate,
excerpts.
right? But you might be able to. You ever what is it, TNT, that used to do all the 5-hour long versions of the radar movies.
Yeah.
Commercial break would come right as something's about to happen, and then you forget where you're at by the time you get back from it.
Exactly.
So maybe you show that, right?
Hey.
Maybe you show the Turner movie version of it. But
good grief.
Yeah.
Church will be alone that day.
Bro, that is all right.
So, but you know what? This whether or not, churches or Christians should use AI. I mean, that's an interesting question.
It is an interesting question.
Especially, considering, churches that may not have the staff, right? Because I think, that is a practical consideration. I guess it really depends on what you want to do with it, how you're going to use it, man.
Yeah, and there's a lot of folks who are getting kind of called out because they're using it to write their sermons.
See.
It's tricky. They actually did in Germany. They did a full, and this is not our topic for today. So if you want to get to the topic, you fast forward.
Yeah, that's
we're talking about planning special event services today.
Yeah.
But the church conference in Germany, they did a full AI generated sermon, and it was an AI video of a fake pastor who gave an AI generated person, AI generated sermon, and he's leading the church during this pastor's conference, and nobody knew until the guy came out at the end and was like, so this is a person who's just it's all completely AI generated and all this. And it begs that weird question of have satellite campuses actually paved the way for
this
AI ministry? And if AI ministry can even be a thing,
Man.
right? All of that. That is a can of worms.
Yes.
For
another day.
Yeah, and maybe some folks that are a little bit more philosophical than us, right?
Hey, brother. Yeah, that's it.
So today, though, we're going to talk about planning special services. There's a few occasions throughout the Christian year where a special service seems appropriate on the calendar, right? You've got, depending on where you fall denominationally, you may, line up if you're a little bit more mainline Protestant versus evangelical. There may be some other things that you look at. Ash Wednesday is a big one for a lot of folks, particularly that mainline Protestant group. And then you've got Good Friday.
Yes.
You've got Easter.
Right.
You got Pentecost.
Yeah.
All the stuff around Christmas, right?
Yes.
Do you do the Thanksgiving Vesper? That was a big one back in the day for me early in my ministry was the Wednesday night Thanksgiving Vesper.
Nope.
Yeah, right.
Surely do not.
And we
cooking on that Wednesday.
Right, exactly,
yeah.
right? Like that's pie day in our
exactly.
family. Yeah, I don't know if I got time to go through Thanksgiving Vesper because
right.
I'm too worried about this chocolate filling coma I'm putting myself in. Licking the beaters in the middle of the kitchen, right?
That's it.
So, how do you go about? Let's first talk about how do you determine whether or not your church needs to do a special service or whether or not it's the right thing to do? Because before you even get to the planning phase, I think a lot of folks kind of get this backwards: is that they get so excited about doing the special service, and this is what we did. I got really excited about doing the special service. I was like, we never done a Good Friday service before. We need to do a Good Friday service. It's going to be awesome. And I never stopped to ask the question like, hey, is this the best use of the time and resources we have to do this?
Right.
Or is this something that, just seems like something we should do? So I got fired up about it. And now I'm taxing my people. How do you determine whether or not it's the right thing to do?
Right. Well, I've come from a somewhat a unique situation with having planted the church.
Right.
And so we're not as married to some of the expectations that may go along with being a part of a denomination, right? And so for us, obviously, as you alluded to, the Christian calendar plays a huge role, but I found that maybe sadly, a lot of folks are not as familiar with the Christian calendar outside of, Christmas, Resurrection Sunday or Easter, and like you said, maybe Pentecost.
Right.
And outside of that, like All Saints Eve or Day, right after, Halloween or whatever. Folks are not as aware or concerned about it seems like. And so for us, it has been like what makes the most sense for us. So like something related to Easter or Resurrection Sunday a weekend is always going to kind of be appropriate, whether we're hosting it or whether we're partnering with someone, another congregation, fellow congregation.
Right. Yeah, like we partnered together for the Good Friday service last year.
And it was great.
It was great.
I enjoyed it. The
It
Lord
was a
bless.
ton of fun. And one of the things that was really cool about that is that you had some folks who were watching online from Canada, right? If I remember right.
Yep, that's right.
That watched the service,
Yes.
got saved, and
Yes.
came down to get baptized.
Sure
so
did.
you got to weigh whether or not it's the right thing or the wrong thing, but there is fruit to it.
That's right.
100%.
That's
Right?
right.
Like God will use it no matter what. So.
That's it. Absolutely. And I think, but some of the others that, because our congregation is growing to be more multi-ethnic, multiracial.
Yeah.
And so, with that, people are coming in with different practices, different what's the word I'm looking? Experiences, things that they've done, legacies, heritages, that kind of thing. And so there's some expectations. For example, like we don't do anything on Christmas Eve.
Really?
We do not, right? So that whole candlelight vigil thing, we don't do that. And it's not because we're, opposed to it theologically.
Right.
Ours is because, when we planted our church, our congregation was not the one that families would come to during the holidays.
Yeah.
Most of our folks would go visit.
Go out.
Exactly.
Yeah, they're going to mom and dad's church or whatever. Yeah.
So kind of in those, if you will, formative years, that just was never a thing. And to the point of your question today, it has never really become a thing that we felt compelled to do.
Yeah.
We've been asked about, are you guys doing this? No, we don't do that. Oh, okay. And then we just kind of move on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really interesting because so much of the things that we feel like we have to do are part of like just the fabric of what it means to do church in a particular setting.
Yes.
Growing up, I found out our church had candlelight services only once I was an adult. Because we never went to them when I was a kid.
Right.
Right. We were doing Christmas Eve was, the early afternoon Christmas Eve was at mom's family, my grandparents on my maternal side. And then so it was an hour drive out there. And then mom and dad would pack all 6 of us back into the car. And then we're chugging along in our little 1991 Suburban.
Come on.
Putting our gum in the ashtrays and then heading off, driving an hour in the other direction.
Right.
To get to my dad's family. And then we would do stuff with my paternal grandparents and aunts and uncles and all of that stuff. And then we're getting home at like 1 o'clock in the morning, Christmas Day, to try to do it. And so the idea of a Christmas Eve service was never even on my radar until I was an adult in Canada. I was doing some missionary work in Canada. The church we were working with was like, hey, our Christmas Eve service is a massive thing. Like, cool. Like, how many services? And they're like 6.
Oh, my goodness.
Oh, my. Right? So it was all night the night before. There were 3 services the night before, and then like 3 services on Christmas Eve that we were doing and required to be there at. So that was kind of a crazy thing.
Right.
That it was not something that I was exposed to. Coming to the church that I'm at now, we've changed the way that we've done Christmas Eve service, but it's because we're a historical church in this area. We just celebrate 146 years since our church was planted, right?
God is good.
That everybody in our community expects our church to have the candlelight service. We will get people that go to church at other places that they just come to our candlelight service because this is the church that they've always done it at.
Right.
So yeah,
I
think that church setting has a lot to do with it because I've had to learn how to plan one of those services.
Right.
So yeah, the church setting is definitely a big one. If it's something new that you're gonna try, right? Like, what are the considerations that you take there? Is it volunteer pressure is your first thing? Is your team behind it is your first thing? Can you cast the vision for it? Is that, what are the things that you look at to determine whether or not you're going to add a special service?
So first of all, and this is going to sound cliche, but it really is pray.
Yeah.
Because I do think, I think it's beautiful that there's an expectation from this community, that you guys would, for example, host the candlelight service. And I think there is some social pressure, but in that case, that's good social pressure because that's a unifying event in the community. But sometimes I often wonder how much of it is our ego, and that sounds crazy.
I think you're spot on here.
You know what I'm saying? How much of it is our ego that we feel like we ought to do it because it'll somehow or another catapult you in the direction or in the light that you want to be in, or it would continue to allow you to build upon your reputation in the community. So I think you have to be prayerful, right? Because there are other congregations, I would imagine, that might be doing the same thing, like a Good Friday service, for example. And the question is, where is the more powerful message? Is it in you doing it, or is it you doing it with others? Right? So you got to be prayerful. And then, like I said, and related to that is, what's the motive? What's the motivation? In addition to honoring Christ, right? Because you don't necessarily have to congregate in a traditional way in order to do that. But, you just kind of need to think through that. After that, from a more practical perspective, and this may be a little, a bit too earthy or carnal for some folk, but is what has your year been like with respect to the taxing your volunteers? Mm-hmm. So, for example, this year we didn't do a New Year's Eve service.
Okay.
And, and out of the 2 decades of our ministry existence, we've always had one.
Really? So did you guys do like a midnight service?
It was always, historically, it was always like 10 o'clock. We start at 10, kind of have worship, testimonies, eat a little bit, and pray into the new year and have the Lord's Supper.
Yeah.
Right? And then we tweaked the time because our seasoned saints couldn't drive and didn't want to be out at night. Right. Yep. So we started adjusting it. Well, this year, man, I was just tired.
Yeah.
Well, we had a lot of personal things going on, a lot of stuff that was happening with the church, and I was just beat. And I think everybody else was tired too. And so we just didn't do it. We stayed home. We encouraged families to, read and pray, read scripture, pray together, do things as a family, pray the new year in, and left it at that. And it was awkward. Folks were kind of, had question marks over the top of their heads, like, what are we doing?
Yeah.
We're resting.
Yeah.
You know, and so I think, if you're taxing, if you've kind of had this schedule where you're just boom, 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 doing things, maybe some extra things that crept in on the calendar that wasn't contemplated in the beginning, that might influence you.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting thing, like determining what to do and not to do.
Yeah.
On the calendar, and the volunteer, how taxed your volunteers are is such an important thing. And there are alternatives to doing the big event, right? So if you decide, hey, we're not going to do the New Year's Eve service or the Good Friday service or whatever, it's easy enough to put together a little like prayer guide.
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
And you can do, hey, listen, we're not doing this, but here's a half sheet that's got a couple of worship songs that we'll be singing. Everybody across the congregation will be singing these, and then you've got, here's the scriptures that we would read and a couple of questions to ask your family. We're not going to do it this year, but here's something where you can do it. Encourage that worship in the home, and that's something that I think would be really powerful if they execute on that,
right?
Because it's something that a lot of families don't do,
right?
And there is a certain piece of spiritual leadership that is demonstrating in the home what is done in the church building.
Absolutely.
And encouraging that, I think has a lot of value too. But yet, we, especially in church leadership, we don't often think about how our volunteers are running.
Right.
Right? Because we're in the thick of it too.
Yes.
And so it's like, hey, this is the thing we're doing. This is the thing we're doing. This is the thing we're doing. And as soon as you feel exhausted, you've got to take a step back, detach from those moments for just a second and think about, like, how exhausted are your volunteers?
Right.
Because the likelihood that they're running ragged too, because they're doing all the same things. You've likely got, like most churches, you got about 20% of the people who are doing 80% of the work.
That's right.
That old 80-20 principle.
Yep.
That they are running on fumes just like you are, but they are following your lead. They're like, hey, this is the thing that we need to do, and we're praying about it, and God is telling us we're supposed to serve the church and support the initiatives that the church is doing. And if we're not praying about whether or not, like you said, these are the things that we need to be doing, we can be leading those people just on that road into exhaustion.
That's right.
And that rest is a really important thing. So pray about it first and foremost. Is it better to do it on your own or do it with others? I'd love what's your motivation other than honoring Christ?
Right.
Because that's got to be at the forefront of everything. And if it is one of those, like, well, because we've always done it, that needs evaluation.
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah. I think so. I mean, okay, so you having a tradition and a traditional practice is not a bad thing, but it, like you said, is worthy of evaluation, if for no other reason, because you're considering other factors. But we need to think about why, the motivation behind us doing it. What goal are we achieving? Because everything we should be doing is to honor Christ, right? So you can't, not saying you can't use that,
right?
Maybe that carries a day at the end, but we ought to assume that everything that we're doing is geared toward lifting up the name of Jesus, right? So if that is the given, then all of these other factors maybe carry the day in terms of how we do that,
right? I do. I think, though, that this is a really interesting question to ask, is other than honoring Christ, because if you are doing an event and you realize, hey, this is something that we do every year, other than honoring Christ, that there's this pause that you sometimes have to make, and you're like, wait, is this the motivation behind what we're doing?
Right. See,
because that's the big thing. If you're not honoring Christ in it, is it worth doing? Because maybe, all right, so maybe we're not honoring Christ because Christ isn't the focal point of it. So we're not honoring him in the way that we always think about, doing it. If you like, we do stuff on the night that our community does 4th of July.
Right.
Right.
Okay,
and so a lot of folks, we realized our parking lot is full of people, right? Every 4th of July.
Right.
Or, whenever the fireworks happen. They're not on the 4th of July every year. But our parking lot is full of people. And so there's all of these folks that we have the opportunity to minister to, right? And so what we're going to do is we're going to, cook hot dogs. We're going to give away free popcorn and those kinds of things to people who are already in our parking lot.
Right.
And then, do some talking about at the church. Are we honoring Christ for doing that? Yeah, there's people who are here and we're doing it. Is the number one focal point of everything that we do that night, to honor Christ? Well, a lot of it is about building relationships.
Sure.
And so that becomes the secondary thing. But whenever we've evaluated it and we've talked to our volunteers, like, hey, do you think that this is something that, we should do this year? They're like, well, the point of us doing it is really this. The point of us doing it is really this. They've all got a different idea about the purpose for us doing it. And we had to take a minute this year whenever we were talking about it and reset and be like, hey, we have to remember anything that we do, if it's not Christ focused first,
right?
If we're not, honoring, if that's not the focal point, is, hey, we're serving our community by doing this, in the way that we see Christ has given us the opportunity to, so that others will glorify his name with us.
Right.
Then, we've got to evaluate whether or not that's the case, and asking your volunteers, because you may be right on thinking everybody's on the same page, asking your key volunteers, like, hey, why do you do this? Bro, that can be so eye-opening.
That's right.
Whenever they're like, no, well, this is the way that we've always done it, or this is just the thing we always do, or we're doing it for reason X, and you're like, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Like they may not grasp as much of the purpose behind this as as what you want them to. So
that's right. I mean, I was having a conversation with somebody today about the difference between agreeing and concurring, right? You can agree, you can come to, consensus on that you believe the outcome or the decision should be this, but your motivation may be completely different, right? You don't agree because your motivations aren't the same, but you concur, you agree with what the outcome ought to be.
Yeah.
And sometimes people don't always share those same motivations or understanding about the purpose. But let me add something else to what you were saying, Lucas, really quickly, in terms of, other than honoring Christ, what's the motivation? I mean, think about a pastor who is trying to justify a raise in his salary, right? And so somebody says, well, you don't do anything, or you don't do enough.
Yeah.
And so the next thing, is, they may not say it, they may not even be able to see it consciously,
right?
But there could be some subtle pressure to justify their compensation by doing more.
100%.
Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So we're going to honor Christ by having a service on November 1st, and then but really behind the scene is I got to try to justify my raise.
Yep.
I got to justify, or at least I'm preparing, I'm gearing up for it. I need to say, hey, I'm doing all of this stuff. Well, you're doing a bunch of stuff, but should we be doing a bunch of stuff?
That's so right. And we do get in that mode, particularly when we move from bivocational to like where this is it.
Right.
Right. Where you start to do some of those evaluations of like, all right, can I ask for this? Or like if somebody does say, what's this, as soon as it gets put up or the budget comes out and you're like, wait a minute. Right. And that is such an important time for us to do exactly what you said. Like we got to check our egos.
Yeah.
Like, because
because
it's just part of it.
Listen, it's part of it, right? Mm-hmm. David said, I wouldn't offer anything to the Lord that didn't cost me something.
Yeah.
Right. And sometimes, that's part of where the sacrifice, rears its head. But that isn't a concern when or at least not a concern, a consideration, rather.
Right.
Whenever we're thinking about these services, we got to be motivated by the right thing. Otherwise, it's just something that we're doing.
Yeah. So let's say you've decided, all right, we're going to do this service. We looked at it, we prayed about it. We feel like this is what the Lord wants us to do. We're going to do it on our own. It's going to be something for our church. We'll invite the community to come and participate with, or maybe it's something that the rest of the community isn't doing.
Right.
And so like maybe that's what's driven the decision.
Yeah.
Our motivation is obviously honoring Christ, but engaging people in worship. And our volunteers, we went to them, we asked them, hey, is this something that you guys see value in? They want to do it. Now's the big piece. Like, all right, hey, we're good to go. How do you plan the service?
Yeah.
And this is something that in the beginning of my ministry, I had no clue how to do for like the candlelight service, for instance. The very first candlelight service that I was at when I was serving at Redwood Park Church in Canada was this beautiful, incredibly ornate and very moving thing that had, the church had 800 people there. And so there were probably 60 people that participated in it. There were 100,000 people in that community, and I bet 10,000 of them came through in one of the services, right?
Wow.
Over the course of time. It was great. It was a really beautiful, very moving thing that happened with the community, which was, even though they weren't typically church goers, they saw this as a very important night to attend church for whatever reason.
Okay.
And so this was an opportunity we had to impact them with the gospel. I don't have, if 60 people at our church were involved in the production, there would be 2 people watching it take place, right?
Yeah.
So when I came to First Baptist Lake Dallas, we're running now between like 70 and mid 70s to mid 90s, right? There's that kind of fluctuation depending on whether or not anybody's in town and what hunting season it is. Right. It's just kind of where we're at as a church, right?
Yeah.
So when we go to do these initial services, they were sort of like thrown together because it's something that the church always did. So there would be a few Christmas songs, and then it would kind of be like a throw it to the congregation thing where we had a man in the crowd, like no lie, that was asking people about their favorite Christmas memories.
Oh, yeah, that's
all those
neat.
so there was a really sweet thing. But again, when we come back to the questions that we were asking initially, like it wasn't as Christ-centered as it was like, oh, this is a fun, sweet thing that we all do. Everybody feels good, and we sing Silent Night and go home.
Yeah.
We didn't really tell the story. There wasn't a lot about the intention of the gathering. The gospel wasn't preached. And so everybody came together. They were really well attended, right? Because people liked it. They liked sharing their stories. And, if you found somebody with a funny story, you'd like kind of talking next year, like, okay, hey, we need to get them again. And like, but there wasn't anything about it that was really focused on the gospel.
Right.
So we started to look at the way like some liturgical services are planned. We started to talk to some other ministers at other churches on how they plan it. Visited a couple of churches on their, Christmas Eve is on a Saturday, and so they've got like the Thursday service and the Friday services, and they're doing all these stuff.
Right.
Visit a few of those, kind of get some ideas, and bro, the range for these special services is all over the place. So how do you pick the right one? How do you plan the service? What are the things that you do whenever you sit down and have those meetings if you're going to do a special service?
Right. I think you've kind of hit most of them. You do your due diligence, especially if it's something that you've never done. Right. I think at a baseline, for us is going to be scripture and prayer. Right. My model is praise, pray, preach, and part. Right. That's kind of my thing. But so you've kind of got whatever your baseline is, but doing your due diligence, looking at other ministries that you respect and you feel like are, doing it the right way, see how they have structured that service. If they have one, you can frankly kind of think about what it is that you're really wanting to accomplish from a worship perspective, which is why I like what you were saying about the person going through the audience and asking about these, Christmas memories, because that's an element that most people might not expect to see or experience in a worship setting.
Right.
Right. It doesn't necessarily have to be high worship. Right. It just has to be it's just worship, a time that we can, express to God His value and His worth to us. And I think we have the flexibility to be creative in that. And I think, after you kind of see what some of the options are, take into consideration what your normal practice is, pray, to the extent that you involve others, I would vet them to see, because if like in our church where we have guys from a different Christian traditions, they have perspectives, and so you could kind of hear how they had that particular kind of service, or just kind of get their ideas about it and decide what's best, because you can't do everything. Right. And so with that being the case, I often look at, okay, how long do we anticipate being here, and what kind of elements can we put in it to make it not just worship, but in something enriching. In my case, I want people to feel moved by it. Yeah. we're not flicking lights and altering the color and all that kind of junk, but we wanted, want it to be meaningful, right?
Yeah.
So should somebody dance in it? Do you do a little interview in the audience or poll people as they're coming in or something like that? Yeah.
Yeah, I think those can be really important key elements, and they have to, again, they've got to go back to serving that primary purpose. Like, what is that connection? And there can be something to like doing something like that in order to sort of break things up.
Yes.
Right? To help people make the transition during different elements of a service.
Sure.
And those types of things that's really, really important as far as, continuing to keep people engaged.
Right.
And I think even more so, I love so much the purity that seems like it runs through the old, liturgical Christian services.
Yeah.
But the truth of the matter is that we live in a society right now and in a culture right now where in order to try to keep people engaged, we have to be thinking different and outside the box.
Right.
And I'm not saying we need to, have youth group games in the middle of a Good Friday service.
Right.
But at the same time, the elements that we decide to bring in, or whether it's talking to somebody, in the crowd and you kind of prompt a couple of stories from some people that you know and you trust, and those kinds of things can be really important for people making those connection points just with the church in general. And I think it's an interesting view, to do that. All right. So, you got the church service done. And now there's certain special services that we will do regardless.
Right. Like, absolutely.
Resurrection Day, Easter Sunday.
Yes.
That's it. Right.
Yes.
That one is on everybody's calendar. Now, whether you choose to preach a special thing on that Sunday or not, like whatever, but we know that's a calendar date, that's going to be an important day for our church just because of the culture that we've lived in for like my entire life, right?
Right.
Easter is a big day. A lot of people come. Mother's Day is another one. We get a lot of people who come to church on Mother's Day because they're like, hey, what do you want, Mom? What do you want for Mother's Day? I just want my babies. I just want all my babies to come to church with me, right? That's it, right? So you've got those two dates that are big dates. And it's important to plan those services out to know where you're going to go and to not get caught up in the fact that you've got a bigger audience and start feeling a little good about yourself because you got a whole group of people there that's listening to you different from what you normally do. But the Good Friday services, the candlelight services on Christmas Eve, the New Year's Eve services, those kinds of things. When you get through those, right? How do you do a debrief?
Okay. Wow. So I do not do a debrief in the way that it seems other ministries are doing that.
Okay.
I'm not in favor of the, hey, let's see what worked and and highlight that, and what didn't work, let me take it out. Right. I've heard, that some folks, particularly if they have multiple services, by the time it gets to the last service, it's completely different from what the early morning people experienced. I'm not in favor of that, right? But I do debrief. This is on a typical Sunday, I'll come back to my office, and we've got a number of other preachers there, and so I'll say, guys, so what? How was that? Was this clear? Did it seem like it came across okay? Was there anything that I could probably explain better or something?
Right.
And that's probably the extent of it. But I have not, spent a lot of time trying to, after every event, kind of debriefing. And I know others are different with that. If something was clearly amiss, then that would, then we'd address that and kind of figure out how to fix it. But for the most part, if nobody's angry, you know what I mean? Everybody's hugging on the way out. I'm good.
You're good.
We made it. What about you?
We've started to implement this a little bit, and it's been like we're not doing the between services debrief where we would if we were going to do two services and we're not trying to figure out like what worked, what didn't in between the two, and making those kind of on the fly adjustments. But instead, what we're doing is a few days later, we'll get together and kind of talk about it more like the old school like hot wash meetings
Okay.
that they used to do, and say, hey, okay, so what things this year when we did, whether it's Vacation Bible School or whether it's, for instance, last year with our Easter service, we talked about it. Hey, what did we do that worked really well? What did we do that didn't? Because there were a couple of things and you have also commented on this about my preaching.
Oh, see.
Here you go.
Yeah, man.
I talk fast.
You do.
I naturally talk really fast,
yeah.
and when I get excited, that accelerates.
Yeah.
I will talk faster than what it even typically is a pretty quick pace. So learning to slow that down, because when I'm talking, I realize that I'm talking fast. I've already lost people by the time it hits me in my mind that that's something that I'm doing. So doing that when I get excited and when I'm making a point that I'm fired up about, talking to our worship team and the folks that help plan the service and say, hey, so what are some things, like, man, you lost me here. I picked back up here, but you talk so fast in this section, that was the thing that needs to slow down. And so there's some of those kind of evaluations that we do. The other is in determining whether or not we tried to do too much. Because I do think it's important with some of these special services, in particular like a Good Friday service, to be ambitious about the way you want to approach it. And then you can scale back through rehearsals to get to something that's a little bit more manageable, but kind of pushing your people with maybe some songs that are more difficult, or maybe you're doing something thematically, particularly like Good Friday is the one that I go back to, because Good Friday is kind of a dark day. Right. And, we intentionally, with our Good Friday service, we do not leave on an up note. Right. That we kind of want people who come to the Good Friday service to sort of sit in this discomfort of like sin and the fact that Christ died, and knowing like the disciples were leaving. They ran away, and they're in a place where they're sort of in darkness and despair.
Yeah.
And we don't push all of that emotion, but just like, this is what our sin caused is really the theme of that. So we hardly talk about the resurrection at all, except just to mention it at the end, and then just kind of let people sort of sit in that.
Yeah.
And the first year when we did that, there was part of the debrief was that, hey, this was pretty challenging to play through this. And to create this, because it didn't feel comfortable from a worship leadership standpoint. And then, talking through some of those things. So we found some really great value in it, and in particular in explaining the why. Because like, hey, I didn't like this. It was really dark. I don't think that's appropriate for church. And we're like, okay, cool. So let's talk about why we were doing that. And it's given us a great opportunity to explain the why. So yeah, I don't know that I'm as into the like, hey, let's figure out what worked, what didn't from a production standpoint, and like, oh, the lights didn't fire at the right time or whatever.
Yeah.
Those kind of things happen. But like the big thing is, if it gives you the opportunity to explain why you're doing things just a little bit more, so that your leadership has a better understanding of it, then that begins to be something that you see the congregation grasp a hold of.
Yes.
Because whenever they have that same question, because if your leader's got the question, then there's probably 4 or 5 people in the congregation that have the same thing.
Yeah.
And they're going to go to one of them and be like, oh, that was kind of dark. And, I didn't, Lucas's description of the crucifixion was pretty graphic. I don't understand. I got to comment on this. On one of our little like connect cards, why did you have to be so graphic in your description of the crucifixion? And the truth is, like, immediately, like, my hackles are up. It's like, because that's what was necessary to cover for your sin.
Exactly.
Send that back to whoever it came from.
Yeah.
But the truth is, when I was talking to some of our other leaders about it, I was like, hey, I got this feedback. And like, yeah, it was a lot. So, we kind of had the same question, explaining to them why, and then because people had come to them and asked the same question, now they're able to answer it, and now people have a broader understanding of it. So explaining the why, I think, is a cool thing. You got anything else you think we should consider before planning a special service, or determining whether or not we need to do a special service?
So no, I don't think so. I was thinking to maybe just kind of broaden special to not necessarily be married to the Christian calendar.
Oh yeah,
but like just a joint service.
Oh
or,
yeah, for sure.
Something happens in the community. And
yeah, because we did one of these back when there was a whole lot of national and community turmoil.
Sure.
Right? There was a pretty significant demonstration that ended with some cops getting wounded. I think one of them might have been killed a few years ago. Yeah, we got to go into a big service for that.
Yeah, and so you think, and I think it's the same thing, but not to just keep it married to purely events related to the Christian calendar, but there are times where we come together, we seize the opportunity to take the lead on helping to strengthen the connection and the unity within the community. And you got to think, that through for some of the same reasons, sometimes maybe even different reasons, right? What kind of messaging is it going to send to have it or to not have it, to have you take the lead versus yielding to somebody else.
Yeah.
Right. Just some things to think through.
Yeah. Right on, man. That's huge, because all of those things were really important considerations during that period. And I would also say that was probably a pretty pivotal point in our relationship and friendship, was coming together with some of those things. So when, building those bridges has for us been, or at least I'll speak for myself, for me, has been a tremendous, has had a tremendous impact, because we decided to come together to try to do something for our community as a whole, in order to make sure that people were being spiritually nourished and saw the hope even in the midst of tragic stuff. So yeah,
indeed,
I think it's a great spot.
Indeed.
Well, hey, thank you guys so much for listening. We hope that this has been a help to you. Just know these things are difficult to try to figure out. You got to weigh, hey, is there a reason that we're doing this? What is it for? Look at these things, pray about it, talk to your volunteers, figure out what your motivation is. And then when you go to plan the service, I like these 4 P's: praise, pray, preach, and part. Make sure that you are executing well, and don't be discouraged if you can't put on the super production that, the mega church down the road does.
Right.
Just make sure that what you do is done with pure motivations, that you're worshiping in spirit and truth, and God's going to honor it no matter what. No matter whether or not you're wearing goofy sweaters and interviewing the people in the congregation, right, or you're just up there reading, Luke chapter 2.
Yeah.
And then, figure out whether or not you and your team can benefit from a debrief. Maybe you can, maybe you can't. But again, if you're going to do it, the motivation behind all of it is going to be key to everything. And then as special events and things happen in your community, whether they are wonderful things, whether they're tragic things, things that impact our community, is an opportunity and a call for churches to come together and honor Christ, to deliver hope and the gospel right to people in the times that they need it the most. So,
indeed,
man, all great stuff. Chris, thanks so much, dude.
Bless you, brother.
I love picking your brain.
Man, listen.
That's one of my favorite things to do.
Well, okay. If you say so.
Yeah,
well, love you back, though.
If you guys have suggestions of topics or resources you want us to check out, send us an email at thechurchresource@gmail.com. And until next week, y'all have good, get give, and we'll see you.
Holla.